Thanks, Ken. Thanks everyone for having us here, and thanks to Hassan for that presentation. And that kind of a lot of the work that Hassan's doing is really critical to the work that we're doing, because we actually need the evidence to actually be able to kind of have these discussions with kind of councillors and the community, so that people understand what we're trying to do. Just a bit of background, I'm in the City Design and Transport Department, so that's within a portfolio in council where we work with the transport strategy team and the design team. We also work with the planning team and the sustainability teams within our portfolio as well, so it's quite critical to everything that we look at. So I'll just give you a rundown on what we're doing at the moment. This project's the urban design framework, so it's all about public spaces, public life, very much informed by the work of Jan Gell when he was over here in 2011. This project's also joint funded by the state government, so they're co-funding it with council. So it's really about how we improve our public spaces and the public realm so that we make a city for people. That's what we're really talking about. So I'll just give a bit of a rundown of what we're looking at, and then some of the more detailed components that we've been looking at. So really there's a policy context of where we're working within here, and it kind of leads all the way up to the national level, that there's a national kind of urban policy. There's the state strategic plan. We've got a 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide. There's also all of the work that's been undertaken recently in the last several years. Jan Gell's been here. There was the Integrated Design Commission. There was a lot of really excellent work undertaken by them about the city and how we create a city of the future. And really what we're looking at is then more down to the town scale, and then also really the details of the city. So it's really about the town district kind of planning and the site details. And what we're really saying about this project is we're having two parts to it. It's about kind of setting a strategic vision for the future of the city and the streets, but then actually how do we do it? So it's also about the details and materials. So how do we actually get long-term integrated change to occur to our streets and public spaces? And council is also at the moment undertaking a placemaking strategy. So it's really about engaging with the community and finding out what people want for their public spaces. So, you know, these two things kind of work together so that really we have a toolkit for the community to actually kind of create the spaces that they want to have. So just a bit of background of why we're doing it, and this starts to talk about a lot of the other sustainability factors that we're kind of looking at as well, is that there's just an excessive variety of elements and materials within the public realm of Adelaide. So this is just all of the seats that we've got, all of the spare parts, all of the things that we have to maintain and look after. So how do we make it easier for our kind of depot and maintenance crews to actually repair and fix things? There's just all of the different types of bollards. There's all the different types of pavers. So what does that mean for council in terms of sustainability and maintenance and kind of long-term financial planning, procurement, all of those kind of things, that we start to have inconsistent approaches to designing our public spaces. So it's always with the best intent, but if you've got 35 different types of paving, you've got to have 35 different types of stockpiles. You've got to have 111 different piles of different parts. And what starts to happen is that you start to have this erosion of the quality of the public realm. So when a new bike rack wants to get put in, you know, it's kind of like, oh, we'll put it in and we'll kind of get the concrete to kind of match, and we'll colour it and it'll kind of look okay, and it just leads on to an erosion of the quality of the public spaces. And high quality public spaces attract people and make people want to use them. So we're just wanting to improve the quality. There's a big risk aversion. So everything's about, oh, what if a car drove around that corner and kind of took everyone out sitting there? It's kind of like, well, we should be looking at designing the spaces that we actually calm traffic and we create the environments that make people have a shared responsibility. So, it just leads to these things that you have a set of bollards here, and then you have a pole for your CCTV camera, and then you have a pole for your parking, and then you have another pole and another pole. So how do we start to consolidate all of these things and design places for people? Elements are used inconsistently and applied, so it's about the look and feel of the city as well. It's about Adelaide as a place that visitors come to. So, how do we work on these things? And then we need to consider sustainability, including whole of life costs. And this is an example of Hindley Street. So, Hindley Street's one of the busiest streets in the city. But every Friday night, everyone goes out, has a good time. They kind of, have a few too many drinks. They kind of, have a kebab and drop it on the ground. And then the depot's got to come and clean that up. Kind of come Sunday morning, Monday morning, they're down there with their street cleaners and they're scrubbing, kind of getting all the detergent on there, blowing it all into the pavers to clean everything out. But we actually install them on a sand base. So what happens is through time, it's kind of an 8-week cycle. They go down there, they scrub, they blow out all the sand, all the pavers start to rattle, then people start tripping and falling over, and kind of everyone goes, "Oh, what are you doing? What are you doing?" And they go, "Oh." So what happens is then they go back and the masons come back and they relay it all with sand, get it all working right. And then the cycle starts again. Kind of say, how do we look at saying that kind of in the long run, maybe we need to build something of a higher quality that kind of takes those activities so that you're not having this ongoing maintenance occurring all the time. We don't have a palette of materials or approaches for the parkland, so this comes down to equity, kind of, how do people, like a parent with a pram, a person with a mobility aid, how do they actually interact and enjoy the parkland? So it's about improving the quality of our spaces and how they work. So incorporating inclusive design, we know there's an ageing population. Our streets don't really kind of cater for it at the moment. So how do we start to improve those? How do we know that cycling and all active modes of transport kind of provide economic benefits to the city, but how do we start to get our streets to work better for those kind of modes? And then we need to look at future-proofing the city. So really, we know all of the work that Hassan's been talking about. How do we start to prepare for that in 20 years' time, that trees and all of those things take time to grow, and how do we get the right conditions for them to grow? So, that's lots of things that occur at the moment, and there's lots of kind of contested space in the public realm, so it's almost like the iceberg. Once you kind of cut the surface, underneath there's all the services, all the service authorities, and they have requirements saying, oh, you can't plant a tree here, you can't plant a tree there. How do we actually start to work with them to better get kind of plants into the ground to provide long-term value for the city? This is the only asset class in the city that actually increases in value, where everything else depreciates. And there's studies that have been undertaken that say that, in a street with trees, property prices go up, people use them more. So, how do we start to transition our streets towards this? Some of the kind of the objectives and the components is really to have a strategic guide for the city, so building on the strengths, confirming a clear and consistent approach to public spaces, which incorporate urban design and sustainability principles, and providing a set of documents for developers and council officers. So this is all about kind of council, how we do things. Kind of council has a lot of asset classes. So generally what occurs is if a footpath needs to be resurfaced, like the people come in and they resurface the footpath, but then 3 years later the lighting might need to be replaced. So, and they come and dig up all the footpath and then they kind of trench it all again and put in the lighting, and then there might be a few years later and it's like, oh, we want to put trees in here. They dig it all up again and do it again. So how do we start to combine all of this stuff that we can actually have everything undertaken at the same time, and we're considering everything at the same time? So it's more an integrated approach. And if we have the consistent details, it becomes easier. It's kind of the toolkit that you can start to kind of build the city. We kind of like to use the analogy of, you know, we're on the Monopoly board, but we kind of always seem to hit jail and kind of go back to the start. How do we kind of collect our $200 and get past, kind of. So it's really having an urban elements catalogue and then having a strategic guide for our streets. And these are the components that we're looking at. So we're looking at kind of traffic calming. So how do we create street environments that provide opportunities for everyone to use them and feel safer using them. So kind of it's reducing conflicts, setting appropriate vehicle speeds so that you don't have the conflicts between the different users of the streets. Looking at the paths and the pavements and the materials that we use. Do we source the right materials? Do we use the right construction details for them? Water sensitive urban design and green infrastructure. So that's kind of at the core of a lot of things we're looking at. And then interfaces. So that's how actual buildings interact with the street. So how do you have buildings that kind of give the opportunities for public life to occur so that they have the openings for people to kind of walk up and buy a coffee, that you can do your window shopping. They're not kind of covered in just big walls of glass that don't really provide any benefit to the street. And then we're starting to look at the details, so all of the paving, the surfaces, the furniture, the fixtures, the lighting, the light fittings, you know, kind of councils kind of transition towards using LED lighting. So what are the best approaches for using those? And then the whole process that this really fits into the process of renewal. So really this is a toolkit and a guide for us to work with the community to build the places that people want. So they really fit into the process of renewal, where it's kind of third parties, businesses, the public, other stakeholders, you know. We have a bit of a plan for where we want to be in the future. As part of this, and this was a presentation to council, we gave a few case studies of places where this has occurred before. And Lyon in France was an example that we provided that, and it's really starting to have the conversation to say something like this is a long-term plan. It's, you know, it's a 30-year plan for how we improve the public spaces. How do we do it bit by bit that we have a better city? So we just started to say that, you know, this process started in 1989 in Lyon, and that was initiated by the government because they had lots of kind of social inequality kind of concerns and issues, and kind of their key platform and strategy was saying, well, public space, that's a common ground for everyone. So you design good public spaces, it's going to help with all of these things. So what they did was they came up with a high-level plan. They had a green plan for greening the city. They had a blue plan of how they're going to deal with water and how they're going to integrate it into the urban realm. They had a city plan, and then they had a lighting plan as well. So they were the strategic guides. And what's happened since 1989 is that there's been more than 150 public spaces undertaken and revitalised by different designers, landscape architects, urban designers, artists. But what they had was they had a palette to work with. So it was like, you know, you can be creative and you can design these spaces, but this is the kind of palette that you use. And what happened was that there were all different spaces that were created. There were all different permutations, but they used the same palette, which helped the local government and the authority with maintaining and upkeeping it all. This is then one of the components of the urban design framework that we've had endorsed by council. So this is really what we're talking about is the streets of the city. So, you know, Adelaide's kind of blessed by having the parklands around there, but it's the streets that we're looking at that are the public spaces. So what we've undertaken is a kind of a classification of the streets based on the activities that we know are scheduled to occur there and what's going to happen in the future. So we've started to define different zones, different areas. This is really where, you know, this is the city in here. This is where it all occurs. But then there's going to be all of these changes in here in the future where there's going to be an increase in development. There's going to be more urban living, inner city urban living. And then there's really going to be some parts of the city that aren't really going to change much. They're kind of heritage listed. So we've then worked on saying that we provide an overlay to that. So there's all of these layers that occur in the urban design framework, and what we're saying is that there's a paving overlay. So previously what had occurred was that there wasn't a palette of materials that was kind of agreed upon by everyone that this is what we'll use in the city, and that's what kind of led to the 35 different paving types, and we've now been able to get council to agree on a range of materials. So the materials that we've chosen, we've been very careful to make sure that they all have the ability to be sourced locally. So we're looking at using Mintaro slate from the Mintaro quarries for the really prestige, high quality streets, granite, which was used on North Terrace. That was all kind of quarried from a granite quarry out in Outback SA, and then Canman 2 bluestone. So all locally sourced materials. Using red brick as well. Kind of a lot of the bricks that we use are Littlehampton pavers from the Littlehampton quarry. And then using concrete flags. So we've made a very specific decision to say that we wanted to go with the light grey concrete flags that we use at the moment, because there's all of the urban heat island and absorption of heat through darker surfaces. We're using asphalt as well. Asphalt's a very recyclable material, easy to kind of reuse and recycle. And then we've looked at using rubble and other materials for the parklands. But at the same time as well with this process, we've said there's a standard that we'll use, but we know things will change in the future. How do we know and have a process to be able to evaluate materials that we want to use in the future that we know we're going to need to use? And how do we assess them properly? So these are a couple of the key ones that we really want to start using. So permeable pavers and permeable asphalt in our footpaths. How do we get water back into our streets rather than down gutters and pipes and into the Torrens and out to Spencer Gulf? So these are some of the first things that we're going to be trialling using. Permeable asphalt in some areas where you don't get high frequency of vehicles. You know, we may be able to use this in some of our parking bays. In all the streets where there are trees, we'll get the water and get it into the ground and have it to irrigate the trees. And then looking at permeable pavers as well. And that's kind of backed up by a process where we actually say we're going to trial this. We do a proper holistic assessment of it. What are the issues with procurement? Where does it come from? How are we going to build it? What's the construction methodology? What are the maintenance requirements? Kind of going back to Hindley Street. Kind of, is it going to be easy to maintain? And then what's the disposal of it? So then we'll identify suitable locations for it, engage with the community saying this is what we're looking to do. What do you think about it? What do you think criteria should be assessed as well? Go and notify council, install it, test it and monitor it, and then evaluate it against the criteria. So we actually know what we're wanting to measure and get out of it. And then if it's successful, we'll put it up to council to be endorsed as a standard. If it's not, well, it's kind of back to the drawing board. We'll keep trying. And then what we've done is we've started to specify materials for streets. So all of the different types of streets that we had before, we've started to identify a palette for each of those types of streets. So you can start to see here that we're wanting to look at using permeable pavements, certain types of paving. And these all relate to the character of Adelaide as well. So it's reflecting the built character of the city. There's lots of red brick in the buildings, lots of slate. So it's really building on the character as well. And then we've started to define what are some of the key characteristics of some of the streets. And what we've actually provided as well is demonstrations. So we're not saying this is what the street will be in the future, but the process we've been through is communicating to say that we can't go and do all of this at once. How do we actually do things in a staged manner so that we actually set up the street in the future for these things to occur? So, you know, if this was a 30 metre street in the city, kind of this is what occurs at the moment. There's lots of kind of angle parking, really wide traffic lanes. We've got massive, big wide streets here. You know, what do we do in the interim that's not going to cost too much money and we can trial and test with the community. So, you know, in this example, we're saying, well, maybe what we could do is change the street to 45-degree angle parking and you only lose a few car parking spaces. But while we're doing that, let's see if we can put the bike lane up against the footpath so that you start to protect cyclists, make it easier for them to use. Where you've lost a few of those car parks, there's probably opportunity to put some trees in. Let's do that and set up the street for the future. And then in the future, when we've got the money, we've done all the work, coordinating with all the service authorities, all of those kind of things, that's when you can go in and do a reconstruction of the street. Start putting in permeable surfaces, providing all the root volume for the trees to grow and sustain themselves. And then showing some indicative examples of what those streets could look like in the future. So starting to say that you'd have footpaths, you could have a bike lane, because that bike lane no longer has to take heavy vehicles, well, that's probably have a permeable pavement. So, you know, you're kind of saving money for council, but then all the stormwater that comes off the streets, it's going to go straight down and water the trees. And then I just thought I'd bring this along as well. This is a component of the UDF that's been developed, and it's kind of out to consultation with key advisory groups at the moment. So that's with the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, TreeNet, the Arboricultural Society, and I guess this is part of one of our toolkits of looking at how we kind of approach the public realm in the future. So this is really designed in a way that it's easy for everyone to understand, and there's a whole range of approaches that you can use, and it deals with public spaces, but it also deals with buildings as well, which we can run through. There's a purpose to it, but what is green infrastructure? And what we're saying, it's an interrelated web of services that kind of service the public realm. So it's a whole range of things, from green streets to living architecture, which is called living walls, green roofs, green streets, water sensitive urban design, the urban forest, and urban food as well. There's a vision for the city streets, and we've developed some principles. So one of the key principles is that green infrastructure starts to become at the start of thinking whenever we do anything. Traditionally, always with green infrastructure and planning, it's always the nice to have, or it's like, oh, we haven't got much money for that, well, we won't do much. What we're saying is it's got to be at the core of what we do if we want to make our cities livable in the future. This is the way we've got to start thinking and recognising the benefits of it. So as part of this, we've provided a bit of context to it as well, so people can understand what we're talking about. Kind of the Adelaide context, a lot of the work, and this is the work San's been doing as well, kind of starting to look at the city and starting to say, well, you know, the parklands are pretty cool. This is another kind of heat map, thermal map of the city, but it's all the streets, all the public spaces, they're the ones that are the hottest places. Looking at the rainfall, diminishing rainfall, and climate change. Existing city form, lots of urban canyons, and this is kind of restricted at the moment by all of the services that fit under the street. And then big wide streets covered with lots of asphalt, lots of heat absorbing surfaces. Social and economic impacts. So these are kind of noise maps, where all the greatest amount of noise is generated in the city. So it's about livability and safety. And a lot of work that's actually informed this is an evidence base that's been undertaken by the Botanic Gardens of South Australia. So they've just, in the last week, they've released a website where they've got a whole evidence base of green infrastructure and what are the benefits. So this has really informed a lot of the work that we've been doing. Ecological change, soils, context of the city. And then we've started to identify what are the benefits of green infrastructure. So improved water management, health and well-being, increased livability, attractiveness of the city, climate modification, so it can assist with cooling the city. And it also has economic benefits and ecological benefits as well. So how do we connect the parklands into the city? We've also looked at the range of scales that it operates at. So it goes right from the kind of the regional scale down to the city, the district, the neighbourhood, down to your backyard kind of thing. So there's a whole range of different approaches that you can use for it, and every bit counts. Been always talking about this, the cost-benefit analysis. So something might cost a little bit more upfront to do, but in the long term, it's going to provide added value. And then we've started to provide some information about all of the applications. So one of the key things that we've always been reinforcing is it's kind of transitioning from this hard engineered approach to a more natural approach. So it's rather than putting everything into a pit and a pipe and getting it away as quick as possible, it's about keeping it on site, retaining it as much as possible. And then we've started to look at living architecture. So the living architecture, we're looking at everything from green walls, green roofs, all of those kind of things. And what we've tried to do is provide information for developers that they can actually start to make decisions about using some of these things when they come into council with a development application. Green streets, kind of defining what are some of the key things about them. Starting to talk about some of the key things that we need to look at. You know, you've got to provide the right amount of soil for trees for them to grow in an urbanised environment, and these are some of the methods that are now being used. This is Victoria Square, in the centre island of Victoria Square, where all of those gum trees have been planted. There's all of these structural cells underneath that actually provide enough room for the roots to grow. If we didn't do that, the road engineers that would have been there saying, oh no, you've got to have this compacted to this kind of depth and it's got to be rolled over 5 times, and then there wouldn't be anywhere for the roots of the trees to grow. So we've put them in to kind of allow the trees to get to a decent size. Water sensitive urban design. You know, what does it mean? How can you put it into an urban environment? The urban forest, looking at a more strategic approach rather than a reactive approach. And then urban food, this is one of the big things in working with the community that we know people want to do. And our placemaking team are out with people asking them now, what do you want to do in their street? And it's about having a conversation with everyone. Well, if you do want to plant in your streets, you know, kind of, we want this to occur, but you know, we need to talk about things like maintenance, management, all of those kind of things. Let's have a conversation about it and discuss it, and let's come to an agreement about it. So get the best benefit for everyone. This is down on Whitmore Square. It's kind of a verge garden that our community development team and placemaking team work with the local community to have some pop-up veggie patches. And then we've started to define the elements. What are each of the elements of living architecture? So we've gone through and looked at green roofs and podium planting, and we've really provided high-level advice, descriptions on what they are, the benefits, and then the design considerations. So, you know, when we're talking with a developer saying, well, you know, this is what you've got to start to think about. Structural requirements for roofs, access, plant selection, starting to identify, you know, if you want to have trees on a rooftop, well, you're going to need to provide this amount of soil. But if you're wanting an intensive green roof, you don't need as much soil, so they can start making decisions. And then going into a bit more detail, saying, you know, these are the different types of approaches that you can use, and these are the things that you need to think about. So there's, you know, there's a bit of a toolkit of different things that can be looked at. More intensive green roofs, if you're wanting to put some trees in there, you're going to need to have the structural capacity to look after it and hold the soil. Green walls, you know, this is a great image of the zoo. You know, there's different types. There's hydroponic green walls. There's green facades that can be used. It's hybrid green facades. This is the one that Graham Hopkins designed that's down on Bentham Street. Climbers on cables, you know, it's a great thing about Adelaide. Everywhere you go around, you know, there's lots of verandas and balconies with vines on them. You know, it's really part of the character of Adelaide. You know, we should be trying to reinforce this. Climbers on walls, climbers on verandas and arbours. So, you know, how do we start to get some of these things occurring? And then we started looking at open space tree planting as well. So this is more for parklands areas, amenity trees, what are some of the requirements? Revegetation and biodiversity planting. So starting to actually identify as well that council has a seed bank in its depot. So if anyone's doing work in the parklands, you should really use the seed that we've got that's of local provenance. Don't go to a tree farm out in Victoria or New South Wales. It's about starting to get more upfront thinking and planning in place. And then we started looking at water sensitive urban design. Well, street tree planting, but passively irrigated. This is North Terrace. Starting to identify details if we're wanting to put trees. You know, these are going to be the minimum sizes, the minimum spaces that you're going to need to have soil with. And this helps us also negotiate with developers when someone's going and doing a new building and they're going to have to remove a few trees to get all their kind of plant in there or whatever. It's at least saying, well, look, this is the standard that we have and this is what we do. This is what you're going to have to do if you're wanting to plant trees in the footpath. So different types of paving in roadways, you know, how do we get the right conditions in there for the structural loads? Street trees in planters in some locations, understory planting, permeable pavements. So how do we actually have the right pavements to allow water to come in and irrigate trees and planting? And then water filtration and treatment systems. So some of the things like rain gardens that we can use on all the extensions to curbs when we build out our footpaths. Swales, how can we use them? You know, you go into the parklands and there's a car park in there, but it's all surrounded by bollards. Maybe we should get rid of the bollards and have swales around the edge that kind of let all the stormwater run off. They provide a bit of a obstruction for people, you know, who might want to drive onto the parklands. It serves another benefit. Constructed wetlands, this is down at the Botanic Gardens. So just starting to show that you can do these things as well in an urban environment. Recycled and collected water. Water infiltration systems. So how do we actually detain water on site? The potential to have potential reservoirs underneath the roads. Aquifer recharge. And then we started to look at implementation. So having a more integrated approach to how we do things. And then starting to look at what are the things that we need to investigate as a council in the future. What are the policy levers that we can put in place? So actually saying, you know, do we have a ratings tool, or do we, you know, give a rates rebate, or all of those kind of things. How do we actually start to make this occur? And they provided some information on some of this is City of Moreland in Victoria. They've got a kind of a rating tool for how they implement green infrastructure. And this was some of the kind of visualisations that we provided to council saying, you know, needs to occur in a staged manner, that you actually have all the consistent details and then you start to build the street. And that in the future, kind of, this is Perry Street down near Wyatt Street. That in the future, we could have these streets that are green, a lot more space for people, safer for people to use as well. And then some of the implementation challenges. So, you know, these are some of the key things that we've got to deal with, but what this project has done for us is released us to actually start to have discussions with all of the service authorities. There's lots of legislation that's in place. Kind of what happens now with the Telecommunications Act is that if someone wants to put in a fibre optic cable, they can just horizontally bore underneath all the trees that are in a street, put in their fibre optic cable, and then when the trees die, we're not allowed to do anything because we're on top of a fibre optic cable. So, you know, how do we start to have these discussions with all of the service authorities to say, well, look, this is what we're wanting to do in the future. How can we kind of allocate the space for you to do these things? And what we started to provide was some opportunities and what could be in the future. So, you know, looking at Perry Street, You can kind of see it there, all of the services riddled everywhere. How do we work towards, and it's, you know, it takes a long time, but, you know, having a common service trench in the middle of the road where everyone's services go, and we actually provide enough room for all the soil for the trees to grow, or are there green roofs on these buildings, or are there green walls? What's the best approach? And this is Halifax Street, huge wide streets, lots of space, heaps of grass that's already there. Some of the approaches we were saying here is there's really good opportunities to just break some inlets into the curbs, just let all the stormwater that's kind of going down towards the parklands kind of go in these areas and infiltrate, plant some more trees. And then some of the smaller streets in the future. So, you know, when development will occur, people will need to come in and upgrade their services. If we start to have some of these plans in place, we can say, well, no, this street in the future, it's going to have trees down here. You can't go and just upgrade your high voltage power down through here. You're going to have to put it over here so we've got the space to plant the trees in the future. That's Flinders Street as well. So how do we transition? And at the same time as well, what we've actually undertaken is the development of tree typologies. So saying these are all the different types of streets. The trees that we'll use will be based on the characteristics of the street. So if there's a 40 metre wide street, well, we're going to put in bigger trees because they'll respond better to the kind of built environment. There's more space for them to grow. And what we've actually developed is principles for how we do it. And then a whole palette of street trees. So we're not going in and saying this street's going to have this tree. There's a whole range of trees that can be used, and the same process. We know trees that work at the moment, but what other ones that we haven't tried before do we want to pilot and use? So that it's, you know, it's a discussion with the community. So there's a whole range, plethora of kind of trees. Native, indigenous, exotic fruit trees. We really, you know, if we're going to put them in, you know, we've got to come to an agreement of, you know, there's going to be, who's going to look after them? You know, let's have a partnership and do this so that we can make it happen. So there's probably a look and feel to the city, but there's a whole range of plants that you can use. Let's just kind of have a little bit of guidance around them. And then the Botanic Gardens have got a plant selector tool as well, so we'll be referencing that, saying, you know, all these plants have been tested, they work here, how do we do that? So, thank you. Thanks. Cheers.